Good evening. Could I ask you to take your seats, please? Good evening, and thank you for coming out on a rainy evening for tonight's event, sponsored by the Canadian Institute for Historical Education. We have Manifest Destiny, or Manifest Destiny, how the HBC, the CPR, and Sir John A. helped to build a Canadian nation against the odds. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you to those of you who are watching online. And we thought that a conversation, given the context of our neighbors to the south and things that are going on in current events, that it would be interesting to have a conversation about the topic that we're talking about tonight in order to put today's events in historical context. So that's what we have two people that are very well positioned to do that for us, particularly Stephen Bown, who's the author of two books. Two books, one about the HBC, which is called Company, and one about the CPR, which is called Dominion, and both of those played a role in Canada's efforts to exert sovereignty over the West, and so that's going to be the focus of our conversation tonight. And Professor Christopher Dummitt, we're very happy to have with us again. And Chris Dummitt is a professor of Canadian history at Trent University and the author of a number of books about Canadian history, including one about Mackenzie King. And he's the host of a very good podcast called 1867 and All That. And if you're not familiar with that, I commend that to you because it really is a great introduction to the maybe 3 or 4 decades leading up to Confederation. And he's got some new projects as well, one called Well, That Didn't Suck, which is an effort to make history interesting to young people as well. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Stephen. We are going to give away a copy of Stephen's latest book, which is Dominion. And this is, hopefully this is going to work, but I have the numbers of the chairs here in this container, and I'm going to ask Stephen to draw a number.
It's like being on Oprah.
Yeah, don't ask me about the life, the universe, and everything. The answer is 5 this time around.
Number 5. Well, that makes it easy. It's actually, well, I don't know. I'm guessing that this is number 5 right here, but I'm guessing, but Bob Bothwell, you've already read this book, so I'm just going to move 3 to the left here and give it to this lady. There, that is for you, and Stephen will sign it afterwards if you like. So we do have copies of Stephen's books here. We're very grateful to the folks from Book City who are here and will be happy to sell you copies of books, and Stephen will sign them afterwards. So with that, I will, I should tell you about one event coming up on Wednesday, January 21st. The next event in this series is by John Ibbotson, and he'll be talking about the duel, Diefenbaker, Pearson, and the Making of Modern Canada. And that's in this room on January 21st. And David, if you just back up one slide, please, for a second. The purpose of this organization is, which I should have said before I went too far, is promoting historical literacy through research, education, and engagement in the public square. And so these are the kinds of events that we like to do. So with that, I will turn it over to Christopher and Stephen.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Alan. It's my real pleasure to be here to talk about history. And I love you all because you've come out to an event to talk about history. And, excuse me, I wanted to start by saying how amazed and impressed I am by this man. Because Alan just talked about his 2 recent books that are available for purchase. But if you go to his website, and if you probably go to the bookstore, chapters, your local chapters, and look at the bookshelves, this guy has written just an enormous amount of popular history. It's incredible. You make your living writing books about history, some of which are about Canadian history, and you make your living doing this. And I just want to say, that is an astounding and amazing feat.
No one is more astounded than myself. But I have been doing that for a long time now. And one of the greatest ironies is, at one time I sensed there was some, issues in the United States, and they were no longer as receptive to Canadian authors. And my agent was saying, for some reason, they don't seem to be interested in this anymore. That's where most of my income came from. So I was like, oh, crap, what am I going to do now? Because when I started off writing, I had originally had a great interest in Canadian history. No publisher anywhere wanted anything to do in Canadian history. No, we're not publishing that. No one's going to be interested in that. And I think they already had a bunch that were already quite successful, and they didn't want any new ones. And then sort of just before the pandemic, they said, we need a book on Canadian history. Do you want to write one? You got to pick one. And it turned out that that's my most successful book. The company sold over 60-some thousand copies now and still sells. It's outsold all my books, which were bestsellers in other countries even. And so that no one expected it. So there you go. There is an interest.
Yeah, that's an amazing feat. That's when you look at Pierre Burton's and similar people's book sales from the 1970s, they sold just outrageous numbers of books, and that really doesn't happen anymore, especially in Canadian history. No. But I noticed that you seem to have you started off in doing books about great topics, history of scurvy.
I love scurvy. Not to have it. The fact that we don't have it anymore is what I really love. But
seems like a good development. But you seem to have moved from science to exploration, and that seems to be your where you find a home is in the world of exploration and history and adventure. And is that the development that you think you've taken?
Yeah, those people always, whether it's their marketing, the marketing angle to their schemes, because a lot of these, they have to seek funding, whether it's explorers all the way back from the 16th century, and they're all boasting with the land of jewels and spices and everything in it. I could just imagine them going, shit, how am I going to sell this? Either I'm going to go back to being a fisherman, or I got to convince the king to finance a voyage that I'll be in charge of. And then they have all these outrageous claims about all the riches they're going to find, and the gold and the jewels and the spices, and surely you'll be the most important monarch if only you fund my voyage. And these are guys, are the same level of hucksterism existed back then as it did with, Roald Amundsen, that famous Norwegian explorer who was, he navigated the Northwest Passage in Canada, the first through there in the early 20th century, but he also went to the South Pole, and he went to the North Pole, flew over in a dirigible. He was responsible for early biplane flights trying to reach the North Pole. They thought there was a continent up there. They said, for surely there's got to be one. There's a continent in the south, so there must be one in the north, otherwise the planet would have wobbled and spun off into space or something, right? And so he had these biplanes, and this is the era when they didn't even have a glass cockpit. They would sit outside in the polar wind. They go outside, their big leather coats on and their earmuffs and their big goggles on. They pull the propeller, and they rush and they jump into the cockpit, and they start trundling across the ice. And of course, every now and then they smash one of their landing gear or something like that. And anyway, they're trying to fly to the North Pole, thinking there's going to be somewhere to land when they're up there, and they're just setting off to do it. But anyway, his whole scheme was boasting and convincing everyone about the lands that he's going to discover in the north, and how great it will be if we did this, and how awesome it would be this. And he's selling tinned meats, he's selling shoes, he's selling straps. Every little bit of money that he could get to finance his voyage, he's just out there talking about it. And when I went to write that book, I discovered, it was just when the New York Times was digitizing its archives, and this is a great boon for historians, as I'm sure you know, the available information. I was just playing around with it. I bought myself a subscription and started looking, and I realized it started going page after page after page, and I was like, what the hell's going on here? And it turned out there was 350 articles on Roald Amundsen from the New York Times over a 15-year period of time in the early 20th century that no one knew about, because it would have taken a lifetime to go hand searching for that, and no one even knew it was there, because the British historians had taken over the narrative and presented Amundsen as a dastardly dog who defeated, Scott onto the path. And then they kind of said, and then he retreated in ignominy into Norway, and no one ever heard of him ever again. And what was revealed is no, he was in fact a celebrity in the United States. He lived in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. He was famous. And that all came about because of the ability to use technology to search. But he's just through those articles, which they were more like society page write-ups rather than hardcore news. They were like describing what kind of food he ate and what kind of clothes he ate and what his speech was to the students at this college. And you really got a sense of the person and a sense of what a swindler that he was. You're like, borderline swindler. Swindler adjacent, let's go. But some of these characters are just hilarious. And that goes right through to the fur trade in Canada, too. Them are all they're characters cut from the same cloth. They stand up bigger than life, and they're, just the things that they did, the adventures they were up to, the dreams that they had, and how they pushed things forward. And that all came into Dominion, too. The people who were out looking to survey for the railway, I mean, these are real adventurers.
I think what you can get already, if you haven't read Stephen Bown's books, is he likes adventurers, he likes rascals, I think, and he likes gossip, like any good historian. Every good historian loves to gossip, because that's where the juicy bits are, and until you go and prove that it's correct or not, right, before you can do it. But you kind of take me to an area where I wanted us to I'm going to gently push us towards a large character that might be dominating world history and politics today. But I want to get there by talking about, maybe some of you might know of this guy named, two figures. One you probably have heard of and one you might not have. One is the great Canadian historian Donald Creighton, biographer of Johnny MacDonald, who used to say that history I'm going to get this wrong, and Bob Bothwell's going to get mad at me, but it's something like it's a result of, it's all about character and circumstance. The result of interaction between character, great characters, and circumstance, contingency, chance. And Karl Marx said something similar when he said, all men make history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. I'm butchering it, but that's the gist of the line. And I used to, when I was going through graduate school in the 1990s, it was all about the social forces, the larger social forces at work, right? It was very obvious to see that. I'm a Gen Xer. It was the 1990s. Mostly, it was issues of meaninglessness and alienation. Those are the biggest issues. And we live in a world today, don't you think, where that is pretty far away. It's hard to imagine that those were the major issues on young people's minds, were meaninglessness and alienation. And do you think that this new context in which we live makes a history that sees the influence of individuals, of character, more significant? It's easier to believe that now. It's more easier to believe in a kind of great man history because we're sitting here witnessing the influence of one large man and a series of others fundamentally alter global politics. And does that change how you think we think about history in that way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Probably it does. I mean, there are some characters that are just bigger than life. They had a huge, enormous influence or impact on the change of current events. And I guess it's sometimes in the past there was overly much focus on just those handful of individuals, and so the entire story would have been told as if everyone else is just a bit player and there's nothing else going on in the world except for these people. Now, I know which big man you're talking about, and I'm sure he would love
sure?
it.
I'm not sure.
I'm sure he would love it if everything in the world revolved around him. But when I write, I always like to tell these big people and their outsized egos, because they are interesting characters, even if they're annoying as all anything. I mean, they do impact the world. They drive things forward. Johnny MacDonald is a classic one. I mean, we wouldn't even be sitting here in this country if it wasn't for a person like that. And he's just as much of a rascal as some of those other explorers. He swindling to create something from nothing. But if you only focus on those big people, you lose track of the lives of all the people who are merely going about their existence within the context of those bigger events. I mean, there's all kinds of things. There's like 40 million people in Canada right now, and we all check the note. We all read the news and we know what's going on, but that's off. That's there sometimes. We're still focused on our life, our families, our dreams, our own individual goals. And what I always try and do is to mash these things together and come up with a blend that incorporates the larger, mighty narrative and the most important people and the people who are driving things forward and the biggest technologies that are affecting the land, and then tell the stories of people within the context of those larger events. How are they responding to that? Because, I mean, when there's millions of people, I mean, everyone, you could, if you wanted to take the most extreme version of it, everyone has their own history, which is true, but that's meaningless though, right? So at the other end, you could just say, the only person that has the history is the big guy at the top, and everyone else is meaningless. And so if you always, I'm sure you've wrestled with the same thing. How do you get the balance right? How do you present the world as it was? What are the forces that are influencing people that are not just the opinions of the person at the top? There are other things going on, and it's important to tell as many different versions of that as possible so that we can actually understand the context of times within which decisions are being made, because that's a big thing that's everyone's talking about now too. Like, how do you assess historical figures? You can't just look at them and just say, well, how come they're not behaving like the person should be behaving now? Well, of course they're not going to be behaving that. They just got off their horse, they rode through the mud for 5 hours to get to the meeting. They didn't take an Uber across town. I'm sure that affects your mind.
Well, you said a word there that I wanted to get to, is context. I think you'll agree with me that context for historians is like location for real estate agents. It's everything, right?
Yeah, everything.
What's the most important thing? Context, context, context. I was thinking, I'm trying to find a way to blend what we think about today to the past, and I was thinking about the way in which historians of the future, when they look at 2025, it's hard to imagine that when they look at Canada, they're not going to talk about the extent to which Canadians are today obsessed with America, obsessed with American politics. We're fascinated by it. I think we fear it. Mm-hmm. I think we're defensive. We're just a little obsessed in general. But one of the things I notice about your books is that, of course, you know this is in no way new, is it?
No, it predates the existence of our country. I mean, going all the way back to the early 19th century, from the northern part of the continent has been obsessed with the idea that the United States would open.
Is that good?
I hope so. Is it okay now? Came back on. All right. Sorry about that. Yep. So, yeah, for hundreds of years, that's all everyone talks about. I mean, the manifest destiny, the whole concept that the United States had, that they were going to consume the entire continent and no one else should be living independent of their empire that they were running through. And I mean, that dates right back to the early days of the fur trade. I mean, after existing for hundreds of years, the fur traders had pushed their way from Hudson's Bay, traveled up the rivers. Finally, when they had built some inland posts, the traders were going there. The Northwest Company from Montreal was coming across the continent, driving a different version of a similar trading concept. And these people made their way all the way out to the Pacific Ocean by the early 19th century. What is going on with that thing? The whole idea of the United States taking it over dates right back to the early 19th century, when there was the American Fur Trade Company, and it sent its ships all around. And who discovered the mouth of the Columbia River first? Was it George Vancouver or was it Robert Gray from Boston? I mean, it's hard to even conceive now that would be that would be important, but at that one time, that, George Vancouver had a bad day, like tonight, the rain was out and the fog was there, and he sailed past that river and didn't see it. And then several months later, I believe Robert Gray from Boston went in there and marked that he found a river. And that became a negotiating point on who was going to control the Pacific Northwest. One of the things that people talked about, the Americans said, well, our naval captain went there first. And the British couldn't argue that he didn't, since the record shows that Vancouver sailed past it and didn't notice there was a river there. And then fur traders coming down on the Columbia River, they'd been searching for that river for ages. And it was David Thompson who sailed down there, and I believe it was 1806, maybe. Anyway, he arrived there just a little bit later than some other people, and so much determines upon the timing of when these people were traveling to the coast. And the negotiations, so when they were talking about the boundary, the Oregon boundary question in 1846, they all looked back in time, and that's what the debate turned around, was who was where first and who could lay the biggest claim to it. And the Hudson's Bay Company, who had, was basically the only entity that had existed there with its supply lines that crossed over the Rocky Mountains. It's really cool. You can actually go in Jasper National Park. There's a famous backpacking trip that you can do. And I went and did it with some people. It was Athabasca Pass, which for over half a century was the biggest land portage connecting a river system that ran from either Montreal or Hudson's Bay all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's 50 kilometers of pretty rugged hiking. At the top, all the fur brigades used to stop and have a toast to the nabobs of the trade at this little lake called the Committee Punch Bowl at the top. They used to bring their whiskey in. And now you can just hike it. But back then, David Thompson had so much trouble getting over that pass that's what delayed him. And the weather was bad. A Chinook rolled in, and their sleds weren't going in the snow properly. And certain events like this happened to conspire to make sure that he arrived at the coast a little bit slower than the other people. It just amazes me that the small things can magnify up into something big over time. And of course, as we know now, the United States did end up claiming all of the Pacific Northwest. But at one time, it was all Hudson's Bay Company tier. The only commerce there was Hudson's Bay Company. Cree, French, and English was a distant third, were the languages that were spoken by all the people there, because the fur traders, they all had indigenous wives, indigenous families, and they brought that culture with them. You wouldn't think that Cree would be a language that's spoken down near the Pacific Ocean in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, but at that time that was one of the key languages of the trade. And it was only that the negotiations between the United States and Britain, eventually the United States was able to claim all of that territory because American pioneers came out on the Oregon Trail beginning in the 1830s, and they voted that they were going to join the United States in the Hudson's Bay Company. They're just a trading company. They couldn't really do anything about it.
The Hudson Bay Company was upset with its employees for not kicking them away.
Exactly, yeah. No, they were, yeah. Because Dr. John McLaughlin, a sort of a failed medical doctor from, near Montreal, was in charge of that region under the control of George Simpson, who didn't like to venture west of the mountains. But he was formed this little community called Fort Vancouver, not where the city of Vancouver is now, but near where Portland, Oregon is. He built it into a community. He had all kinds of people. There was like dozens of different languages spoken. There was gardens. There was agriculture. There was smithing. He was forming a whole town there, which is not what Simpson wanted. He wanted it kept free of people so that it wouldn't influence or damage the fur trade. So McLaughlin built this community up, and when the pioneers, what they called the Oregon Trail pioneers in the United States, they were arriving, they had nothing. A lot of them are destitute and probably would have starved to death. So he was giving them credit at the company store against the wishes of the Hudson's Bay Company in London and in Montreal. And he, in no small way, caused the survival of those people who then voted to join the United States. And then there was the Boundary Commission, settled on the 49th parallel and all that territory which Britain was hoping to claim for itself. disappeared. They were hoping to claim at least the Columbia River, but then it was all lost.
So the lesson of that is be careful who you invite for dinner.
Exactly.
Right.
And 10 years later, they invited more Americans, tens of thousands, 30,000 swarmed up because of a gold rush on the Fraser River a little bit further north. And that was the next version of Manifest Destiny. There were so many Americans came in there that they feared the exact same thing was going to happen. These people are just going to vote that they're part of the United States now. And so it turned out differently.
James Douglas takes control.
Yeah, I mean, he's a fascinating character too. And he did take control. I mean, it was often like 6 months of communication between, the fur trade outpost of Fort Victoria and London. It was not easy to get any kind of news back and forth or instructions. So he just pretended that he had control. He marched over and said, I'm the governor of this new colony. And he said, what colony? The one, he was thinking, the one I just made up. Go away. So he invented the authority for himself and proclaimed that there was British authority over that land and started enforcing it upon the American miners. The first thing he wanted to do was charge them all mining license fees. And then even the British government finally had to snap his hand a little bit when he started claiming that there was a Hudson's Bay Company monopoly on all commerce, and they had to buy everything from him. Because at the time, he was still the director in charge of the Hudson's Bay Company, as well as pretending to be the governor of the colony. So, yeah, he's a fascinating character.
So I think that's an era of history that a lot of, where we are, Ontarians don't know very well, right? We just don't know British Columbia history. And that whole era from the 1840s, earlier 19th century, the 1840s, up to the 1860s. It's just not something that we learn a lot about. One of the things I love about your book, Dominion, is you start there. You start with these eccentric cast of characters in the 1860s in British Columbia with James Douglas, with Amour de Cosmos, that's somebody's real name. He chose it, that is his name, the kind of crazy eccentric guy that he was. And they're forced with a choice at the end of the 1860s, aren't they? Alaska has just been purchased by the Americans. Yeah. The Oregon Territory has been taken by the Americans. They're about to be squeezed out. And there's a real choice that the people in British Columbia have to join the Americans. Yeah.
In many ways, that was the logical choice.
It was a much more logical choice. So what is it? Why do you think why did they choose Canada?
There's a couple of reasons. One, a lot of the American miners left because the mines had petered out by that time, and they had moved back to California, where an American railroad had been pushed through, and that was generating a great deal of commercial development. There was a lot of economic opportunity. So a lot of the people who came in the 1850s returned to the United States. So that swayed the vote one bit. The Hudson's Bay Company employees and their families, that constituted a large part of the non-Indigenous population at the time. And it was also John A.'s promise to build a railroad. The Americans didn't offer to build a railroad. But at that time, all of the commerce of Fort Victoria was with San Francisco. Its communication through paddle ships was with San Francisco. They even used American postage stamps. So, the Americans just assumed that it was going to become part of their thing through the Manifest Destiny idea, right? And it would connect to Alaska, and it would connect to the Washington. It was only the promise of a railroad that made them choose differently. Without a railroad, there was not going to be any British Columbia joining. I mean, they had multiple mountain ranges before they could even get to the prairies, before you could even spend months crossing the prairie, before you could spend even more months going over North Lake Superior, before you could even get to this area called Canada. People didn't even know what Canada was. No one knew what Canada was. Canada was a non-existent thing. It's this new country formed in the East. No one had ever been there before. So it was quite a... It could have gone either way. I mean, when we think about it, really, it should have gone to the United States. So it was the promise of that thing. And, John, it was a bit of a swindly problem, too. I mean, John A. had no idea how he was going to build a railway.
That's what I wanted to say. When I was reading your book, Dominion, I was thinking, it was making me think what a crazy promise it was that the Canadians make. And they put it up on the British Columbians. They offer it to them. They say, hey, you should ask for a railroad.
Yeah, told them behind in secret rooms, don't even ask for it, demand it.
Yes, but we're sitting in a city. You don't live in Toronto. I don't live in Toronto, but even I know about this. But the Eglinton Cross Crown right? When was that promised? In 2011? And it's supposed to open next month? But who knows? So think about this. 1871, right? MacDonald promises this unbelievable feat of engineering. They have no way how they're going to build it. They have no way the route. They don't even, like, one of the great things that it come clear to me as I was reading your book is they're like in 1883. This is only 2 years before it's finally finished. They're like navigating through different valleys in what's now southern British Columbia, thinking, wait, we should come this way.
Yeah.
And like it's all up to chance. Like it's already 3/4 built by that time, and they still don't even know how they're going to finish it.
No.
It is hard to imagine a less 2025 thing than the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway.
Yeah, it's a bit of huck and hope, wasn't it? Like, they just went ahead. I mean, if it hadn't succeeded, I think probably the financial collapse in Canada would have basically wiped us out, and we would have been consumed by the United States back then. The Bank of Montreal was so invested in that thing, as well as all the prominent, all the money in the Canadas was all funneled towards that one thing, the government debt that was on it. I mean, you can imagine the stress that would have been on John A. MacDonald's shoulders seeing this thing. What if it collapses now? Like everything he worked his entire life for would have been completely, just wiped out if that hadn't happened. And of course they did manage to push it through. And that's the great irony, is that there's that character named Louis Riel. He sort of jump-started the idea of the railway when he had led the Métis in the opposition to becoming part of Canada in the first place in 1870. And he sort of bookended the entire project in 1885 with a second, uprising, provided the impetus for the final bit of financing to be pushed through to prevent the entire CPR from going bankrupt after all those years. And they needed to have a way to pay for the last bit of tracks to get the troops out to the west to suppress that rebellion. Otherwise, of course, that land would have also become part of the United States, as it had multiple times. I mean, throughout the 1870s, I mean, look, there's the Northwest Mounted Police. I mean, they were sent out there, also a creation of John A. MacDonald, to sort of put a stamp of authority onto that region, because at that time there was American, basically desperados. I mean, you could call them whiskey traders, but they were much more. They weren't, traders. They were violent thugs, people who had been released from the American Civil War and were unable to integrate in society out east. Many tens of thousands of these people flooded to the Western territories and created the anarchy that era is known for. So many Hollywood movies are all about that, the gunslingers and the chaos, and there's no central authority, and the outlaws are everywhere. Well, a lot of those people were coming up into what was then supposedly Canadian territory. The Cypress Hills Massacre was when a group of these desperados came up hunting some horse thieves. They lost some horses, and they thought maybe they went into Canada, and they didn't really know exactly where they went. They were just looking for trouble. There was a whole bunch of them, and they got a bunch of whiskey from some of the trade outposts there, and they started drinking heavily. And there was some indigenous group that was over there who were on very hard times. Anyway, a battle ensued, and they just went and shot and killed and murdered a whole bunch of people with their guns. And then they fled back to the United States. And that was, that was the idea, that you got to have a police force. So John had barely any time. Within months, they had already started sending recruits and organizing them and getting ready to send them out there, because they feared, if the Americans are doing that, and with no real communication, they didn't really know what was happening. Was it a larger force of American troops are going in? Was that just the first of many incursions that were going to happen to take over that territory? The fog of war, they always talk about. The fog of war was a lot more foggy when you don't even have a road. You can get to your own territory. And that was the whole idea of the railroad, too. I mean, how can you maintain political control over a region if you don't even have a way of getting there? In the first real uprising, it took 96 days to get the troops from, central Canada out to Fort Garry or Winnipeg. 96 days. And this was not 96 days of a luxury first-class travel as you're floating around with someone handing you some drinks as you look out the window. No, it was hard, hard work. Day in, day out, through the mud, through the rain, slogging, dragging their equipment and their guns, and that's the only way you can do it. There's not even a road, so it's really the lack of. I mean, this gets right back to context that we were talking about earlier. I mean, that's the context within which Central Canada was trying to create its what I call an empire, because at the time it would have been an empire. Political authority that extended to the Pacific Ocean. At that time, there was no phones, there was no cell phones, there was no roads, there was certainly no railroad, there was no airplane. No one from the East had really even been there except for some of the fur traders. And, at that era, you can never really trust the information that, a person would send back anyway. So, yeah, I like to ramble. One thing goes to the next thing, and maybe it doesn't make any sense anymore. But
I think you were painting a picture for us of the what we think of now as the Canadian West in the 1860s, 1870s, and how precarious it was. I think that's when we often think about it, is the extent of when there's so much distance. You make these claims of sovereignty. That, the Canadian government is signing treaties with Indigenous groups all across the Southern Plains, all through the 1870s. They're claiming that, on behalf of the Queen, to sign these treaties. But it's so tricky. One of the things that this is not a new revelation, but I think when you cover the kind of history that you cover in these two books, it becomes clear that Canada doesn't actually make sense. It doesn't make geographic sense. It doesn't make economic sense. At time after time, it would have been far easier to just join the Americans, right? Building the Canadian Pacific Railway, the question is, do you go north of the Great Lakes in territory where no one is going to live, essentially, it's not agricultural land, or do you take the much nicer route south of the Great Lakes? There are a host of things like that when you're in British Columbia. Do you just take a steamer down to San Francisco, and a few days later you're back west? And moment after moment after moment that those decisions are made. I mean, this isn't the only time we talked about that in the 1950s with pipelines. We still have natural gas and oil pipelines which go through the United States. Slightly tricky now, right?
Yeah, it comes back.
Wouldn't it just have been easier to concede? This is the worst thing to say in this group, but I just feel like it's a question that has to be asked. Don't attack me afterwards.
Yeah, no, it absolutely, so many times. I think I've read a lot about that era. I'm very interested in that. I think the only actual reason this country exists is because Johnny MacDonald was a little bit demented and didn't have a firm grasp of geography or economics, maybe. I don't know, but he just had this idea that he didn't like Americans. He didn't want America to own all that land, and it just bugged him that it did, and he devoted his entire life to make sure it didn't happen. And somehow it all came together, and this country exists. A shared history that goes significant time. But that gets back to the idea of the big person in history too.
Excuse me, why don't you use this mic, and then can I just turn this one off?
Oh, sure. Like that? Causing too many problems? Is that one working? Yeah. So now if I wave my hand. No, it gets back to the idea of the big people in history again. There are some of these people who, you can't ignore them. They're responsible for a whole bunch of things. Look, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It all happened in that time period. It's a huge periods of change and turmoil and violence and starvation and economic depressions. It's inconceivable how hard life was for a great number of people during that time. And within that context, somehow our nation was formed. And I think until there was a railway, it was really a paper nation, though. I mean, it existed in the halls of diplomats, and people would sketch it on maps, but it didn't actually make any sense. Any Americans, if they had wanted to, could have just probably sent 500 people up there and said, "This is our country now." The fact that they never did is just almost a bit of an accident, really. They didn't feel the land was worth sending 500 people up to.
Yeah. Let me go with this. I'm thinking of there's a Canadian writer. Is it? I'm gonna forget. Chinese Canadian writer writes now. I'm gonna get his name wrong, so I won't do it. But he was using this metaphor recently that I heard about, which was not talking about Canada, but talking about America versus China. And he said China is a nation of engineers and America is a nation of lawyers. And it's not a friendly metaphor to countries like the United States, or I would say Canada, right? And by that, I think he meant that, you know, China is a nation that if you want to understand China, it's about a country that wants to build things, and wants to build things quickly, and wants to get things done. And it thinks in that kind of way. In the way that engineers don't care about your feelings, China doesn't care about your feelings. And in a way that you're a country of lawyers, you think about process, nervousness, litigation, cautiousness, and you tend to probably not get things done. Now, I think that's a fascinating metaphor to think about the 21st century, but it also makes me think about politics in the 19th century with the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. It was done by a bunch of lawyers. So why were they different than the lawyers of the 21st century?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think, you know, so much was riding on its existence that there was no way to retreat. Once they had gone a little bit down that road, and they sort of, well, first they created the idea of a country extending to the coast. As soon as you buy into the idea of it, you kind of have some vested psychological interest in seeing it. And then, because they were so ignorant about the technical challenges that they would encounter, it was easy to promise it. Once you promise it and you start investing so much money into it, you get into this too big to fail situation. And I think the CPR was exactly that. Once you've gone a certain number of steps toward that destination, it's a complete disaster to retreat from it. And of course, it's a complete disaster to move forward with it too. But what do you do then when you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place? So maybe it's because failure was inconceivable. Failure results in the collapse of everything. And success...
And the collapse of the nation itself. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that existential threat, as it were.
Yeah, and so many people have all their invested money in there, and some of the financial institutes are so heavily leveraged into that, and the government debt is so enormous to push that thing through that there is no...
So what you're saying, I think this is what you're saying, is that you think our politics should be more corrupt, and our politicians have more money on the line for building of, I don't know, a pipeline to the British Columbia coast, or some similar kind of thing, or some other major national project. If only Mark Carney was more corrupt, we'd have a better country.
Maybe. Or if all of our pension funds was so heavily leveraged into it that everything was going to collapse to the dirt otherwise. You know, I don't think that's a situation we necessarily want to be in, but it resulted in the creation of the country, though.
I think we've got our social media headline for that. We're fine. So obviously, partly, and this is a slightly unfair question because you are, less so with the Hudson Bay Company, but with the CPR, you get its creation. But obviously, both of these institutions in their day were heavily criticized. Heavily criticized because they were essentially government-financed, semi-private monopolies. Right? The CPR, it's a great nation-building project, but as soon as it's built, it's hated by Western farmers. Right? The freight rates, it's the most boring but most important topic of early 20th century Canadian history. And as I was rereading these books, I was thinking, are they like 18th and 19th century versions of like modern day telecoms, like Rogers and Bell, and are we as Canadians destined as a nation to have these, essentially highly regulated government-supported monopolies, because we're Canadian?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that a fair bit, and I wonder that it gets into the psyche that you need to have them, but it's absolutely true. at one point in time, you did need to have that. There wasn't, no private entity could have possibly put through the CPR. They tried. They burned through money. Like they were literally shoveling money into pits north of Lake Superior, buying gravel and dumping it into pits, and wondering how come we've spent millions and millions of dollars dumping gravel into this pit and it's still a pit. I mean, it was literally a money pit. Like they were hauling. They were just wondering, like, what the hell are we going to do? You can't build a railroad floating on the air. You know, it has to be. You have to get some ground. But the astronomical cost of it was prohibitive. No private entity, the entire finances of the whole nation could hardly even afford to build that, and let alone the passes over the mountains into British Columbia. And it defied railway economics of the time, which was that, you know, say you pushed your railway, you only had to get financing to say push your railway, let's say 50 kilometers further. Then you sell the land around the railway. Then you create your own business for the railway, because you have a bunch of farms and some people are growing some things. And then they use the railway, and that finances the next little part of the railway. You keep selling the land. You keep building the economy as you go. But when you're going around Lake Superior to the north, they hadn't discovered any of that mineral resources yet. There was no economic. There's no way to pay for, no company would ever make any money off of any kilometer of track that was built there. So you needed to have the state take over that project and push it through. But when it comes to the Hudson's Bay Company, I mean, I think so much of that is a little bit misinterpreted. I mean, they often will say, "Oh, the king granted them this enormous tract of land," and they this map, and it shows the drainage basin of Hudson's Bay, and look how much land they were given. At the time, they had no idea that what land they were given, because the king just kind of wrote his signature on a piece of paper. They didn't even have any maps, so. You know, the map that shows the drainage basin of Hudson's Bay and how much territory they got, they didn't know what they were getting. And they had never been there, and no one had ever been there. And for 100 years, they hadn't go there. They were operated like wholesale distribution centers along the frigid rim of Hudson's Bay. And the entire inland trade was operated by indigenous business operatives that pushed, you know, they used them as the wholesale centers and pushed the trade all the way to the Rocky Mountains. The company itself wasn't involved in any of that. And it was more... it wasn't even all that profitable for hundreds of years. I mean, George Simpson was the guy who really jacked up the profits on it. But of course, he was a somewhat odious character, and times had changed by then. But for 100 years, the company never left the rim of the bay, and they didn't even know what their trading territory was.
We could go in so many directions here. I'm gonna go in a slightly anti-American direction, hoping I can take the crowd with me on this dangerous territory. Which is to say, when you wrote these books, did you come away thinking, or not, or agreeing with the old way of talking about Canadian history and westward expansion, which is essentially a way of saying that the Canadian westward expansion was nicer? Or maybe nicer is too vague a word, it's not very careful, but it was more orderly. It didn't, you know, it was constructed in opposition to the, you know, and against the American example. So if the Americans are going to go by having a series of Indian wars, which are expensive and violent, what are the British North Americans going to do? What are the Canadians going to do? They're going to sign treaties, and you've already talked about the Northwest Mounted Police. They're going to get rid of the banditos of the West, and they're going to have a more orderly transition. Do you still think there's some legitimacy in that story, which is obviously less, I would say, popular today in the terms of our sense of what, you know, the impacts of colonialism? I know some people would say it doesn't really matter in the end whether you kill Indigenous people by warfare or they die by smallpox. The cultural dislocation and death is the same. Or do you think that it matters, that it actually matters that Canada didn't go to war, tried to impose a more orderly society on the West?
I think everything that you said makes sense, including all the contradictory things, and that's one of the ironies of it, and that's what we have to contend with is history. I mean, there's the good and the bad and the ugly, and it all exists within the same period of time, sometimes within the same people, sometimes the same events, depending on how you look at them, can be both good or bad and ugly. And there is, I'll put the word but there is a difference between the way that Canada came into existence and the way the United States came into existence. They're not the same. We don't have the same history. We don't have the same experiences. The American one was much more violent in a visceral way. Stabbings, gunshot wounds, poisonings, that kind of thing. We just don't have that same level of extreme violence. Lots of bad things happened, some of which were more or less beyond the control, beyond the capacity of the state to solve. I think, the Great Buffalo famine, for example. I mean, the food supply disappeared, and tens of thousands of people normally relied upon that for their, not just their food. It was their food, it was their clothing, it was their shelter, everything. If you remove that, the mighty buffalo herds, you take away from those people everything that they needed to survive and everything that their culture disappeared on, that their culture relied on. So it's a staggering blow. It's almost inconceivable to imagine the devastation of having the buffalo disappear. But John A. Macdonald didn't make the buffalo disappear. The buffalo had been disappearing throughout the 19th century for various reasons, and it's well known and well studied. Exactly, we were being overhunted. The climate was changing a bit, and the habitat wasn't necessarily as good for them. And also, there was a deliberate policy in the United States of using Gatling guns and military troops to just shoot them all dead and let them rot on the prairies, believing that if they shot them, that would starve their own indigenous populations into submission. And so that did not happen in Canada. It happened in the United States, but the repercussions of that reverberated far north of the border. Bison don't know that there's an imaginary line that some people in a hotel room in Washington drew, and that one side of it is supposed to be one country and one is the other. No, they just, if you shoot them, they normally would have wandered across the border. Well, if they're all dead, they're not wandering anywhere. So the problem existed in one area of the continent, but it reverberated all the way north, and it caused enormous trouble north of the 49th parallel. But what was the solution at that time? There was no railway built. The ironic thing is, if the railway had been built a couple of years earlier, the state could have done a lot more to alleviate that issues of starvation by bringing in food supplies. But as it stood, the only way to get supplies into the Canadian West, the prairies, was to ship it through the United States. So you can imagine that when you're in a sovereignty dispute, or a sort of like a lukewarm, cold, whatever you want to call it, sovereignty dispute, we are constantly afraid of the United States taking over the territory. You can't then say to the United States, oh, by the way, we have no way to get to our territory that we're claiming. Can we go through your country and bring food? Which they did do, but it was a lot harder to do it, a lot more expensive to do it. It involved a lot more diplomacy, crossing international boundaries as they were. And anyway, some version of that famine was going to happen absolutely no matter what. I believe, just from reading it, that more could have been done, but the problem was not going to go away at that time. The government just did not have the capacity to solve that problem in that era with the technology that existed and with the infrastructure that existed. Even if they all decided that they wanted to. The farmers along the St. Lawrence, I mean, these are not people that are very wealthy themselves. I mean, everything is done with horsepower. Farming, removing stumps is all done with oxen pulling things out. I mean, there's not a lot of surplus built into a primitive system like that. It's not our world right now. So that's context coming into it again. You can't just wave your hand and make a problem disappear. I mean, that problem right now, if that similar type of thing happened, that would be the simplest of things to solve. You snap your fingers, that problem is solved. There's probably 100 different routes that you could get food to any place in this country and into the United States, anywhere. Back then, there was 0 ways of getting anything of bulk transported from the eastern part of the country to the west.
But there are tons of echoes, right? You think about a whole host of things in Canada today where there isn't east-west transportation links. There aren't east-west, natural gas being one. If you live in the Maritimes, you would have this thought. COVID brought that to our attention, and supply chains. These are things that actually are kind of quite present day as well.
Yeah, supply chains. Yeah.
Okay, this is where I realized that as a grown man, I ought to have a watch, because I'm supposed to keep track of time, and I don't. So I'm ostentatiously pulling my phone out and checking the time. Okay, I realize we're almost done. So I'm gonna slowly bring it to a close with I think a couple more questions. Which one did I go with first? Okay, I'll go with the worst one first. So I apologize for this question. I'm thinking of what are they calling it? The National Major Projects Office that we're setting up. What are projects of national significance, of which the building of the CPR probably would have been one. Probably doesn't not in there. It obviously was the project. So you're a historian. You've studied maybe Canada's most significant national project, arguably. What advice do you give to Mark Harney to recreate the success of the CPR and to not suffer its various failures?
Well, it all depends. Am I allowed to swear? Not at him. I just mean like, get her the F done, like, or have the whole thing collapse again. I mean, it almost. We can't go on like we are with that, economic stagnation, massive debts and deficits building up. It almost reminds me of that era before and around the railway. I mean, the countries, back in that era, there was the moribund industries of central Canada were stagnating and they were doing very well. Many people were just fleeing to the United States for better economic opportunities. Building that railway did change the country because it changed the internal economy and it changed the internal travel and it opened up all kinds of things that came after. Like right now, I'm writing a book called Immigrant Nation, How Canada Became Canada, and that's what happened. After the railway was built, Laurier's great plan of the last best west, bring in hundreds of thousands of people, lots from Eastern Europe, a lot from Britain, a lot from the United States, even though they weren't Americans, they were like Norwegians that were brought up. It radically transformed the country and created an internal economy. So sometimes these big projects are absolutely necessary if you're going to continue down the same road, and you have to reinvent things every now and then. The world is always changing. I mean, every generation thinks is different. I noticed that I talk to my kids who are in their early 20s now. They have a very different view of the world than I do. And part of it is just because they've grown up with something different. I mean, they've grown up with technology. They've grown up with phones. I mean, I try and tell them, well, when I was in university, we had these things called typewriters. They're scratching their head going, no. Like, what the hell are you talking about? And they flick on their phone and they can ask and get an answer to any question that they ever put
Let's
in
be honest,
there. I mean,
you lost them at when I was. Okay, last question, which is maybe hopefully a more optimistic one. We're obviously speaking at this event organized by the Canadian Institute for Historical Education. It's a great new organization that really cares about Canadian history. And I wondered what you think are the challenges and maybe the opportunities for writing and publicizing and talking about Canadian history today, in your experience?
Well, I don't know about the economic opportunities, because it seems that publishing in general doesn't generate a lot of income for a lot of writers. I mean, I'm doing okay, but I've been in it for a long time. But I do notice that there's a lot of really good books coming out on Canadian history in the last number of years. So I think there's a resurging interest in it. And, it's something that I'm particularly interested in, for my own just interest in how unusual people used to live their lives. And like my mom has always told me, she was really involved in genealogy and researching, and she took an interest in all my books. When she would say, Steve, there were no good old days. Everything was bad all the time, just as much as it is now. Now, that's probably true, but I always take it to heart. There were no good old days. I had an ancestor who was transported to Australia for stealing a round of cheese. that was the punishment for stealing cheese because his kids were starving. This is in England, but so anyway, I rambled a bit. What was the,
I'm pretty sure you're not advocating the stealing of cheese, but maybe traveling to Australia.
that would be against the monopoly.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think it's great that we end on a funny anecdote, because I think that's what one of the things your books do a great deal of. So I wonder if you can please join me in offering a great deal of thanks.
And I'll ask the two of you to share the mic for the questions. But thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Chris, for that. We have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions. And please raise your hands of who's got a question so I get a sense. Okay, we've got at least 3 or 4 here. 6? Okay, we're good. I will ask the first one quickly, though. And both of you touched on what the seeming illogicalness of the railway project. And it occurs to me that we say that it wouldn't have happened without MacDonald, but I wonder about the extent to which others who were important in making it happen shared that same vision. You know, Fleming or whoever some of the other characters were. And I wondered if you could both comment on that. And you'll have to share the mic, by the way.
Sure. I mean, tens of thousands of people worked on that railway. So when we talk about John A., we're talking about the guy with the original idea and the concept of it, and pushing it through and generating just the idea of it, the idea of a country, the idea that it could exist. And then different people take over, and there's all sort of engineers and surveyors and workers, imported labor, I call them the temporary foreign workers of the 19th century, the Chinese that were brought over. And the labor brokers in China negotiated for them to be all paid very low wages. And then when they got there, because they were paid low wages, which I'm sure they didn't want to be paid low wages, people hated them because they were putting downward pressure on wages for the other workers. So it's the same kind of concepts that we have now. If all of these things that were problems in the 19th century have their own echoes into the modern society. And yeah, so with the CPR, I mean, look, tens of thousands of people worked on that thing. They all did a huge amount of work, whether it was financing, whether it was concept, whether it was route planning, whether it was engineering, whether it was just manufacturers working in a dynamite factory. I mean, everyone was involved in it. It was the central thing around which everything in that era revolved. But one person had the idea to do it and really pushed it, and everyone else fell into place afterwards. Would you agree with that?
I think we should go to other questions. I don't have too much to add to it.
All right. We've got a number of questions, so we'll move on here.
Excuse me. Well, thank you. This may seem a little anachronistic, but I was struck by you trying to grapple with the difference between Americans and Canadians. And I was struck a little bit by saying, well, on one hand, the Americans are Republicans. And what do we say we are over here? I mean, I would say in my family history, we would have said, without a doubt, we're British subjects. And then it's not just the monarchy, which we've sort of allowed to sort of disappear in our history back 60s, 70s, whatever. But the whole concept that we were different from the Americans really was based on not just the monarchy, but British parliamentary traditions and things of that particular nature, which I suggest was one of the reasons why we didn't become Americans, because there were enough people still back here wishing to say, we're different. Any like to comment on that?
Yeah.
It's almost like you planted this question because I wanted to answer it. I've spent the last month or two reading the 1964 flag debate, which is the perfect way to study this question. And you're exactly right. And I think the travesty, I love the Canadian flag, the version of the Canadian flag we have now. It's a great flag. But the process by which we chose a new flag and a whole series of things happened in the 1960s, 1950s, on the 1970s, changing of Canada Day from Dominion Day to Canada Day, changing the name of everything. It was well-intentioned, but it ultimately has robbed English Canadians of a sense of our uniqueness. right? And it was a choice to have a civic nationalism where everyone could find a home, something that John Diefenbaker and I today think was not necessary. John Diefenbaker was a German, Scottish, Canadian. He could love the red ensign and still, but still see Canada was different today. And I think you're onto something. The way in which Canada fundamentally transformed its identity from the 60s through to the 80s under Pearson, Pierre Trudeau, Louis Saint Laurent, and it was well intentioned, but it should be seen as a travesty, I think.
Okay. We have a question here at the back.
With the death and the vacancy of all our big city bay stores, do we have any idea what's happened to the vast network of small northern community supply centers and trading posts, which the Hudson Bay Company has been?
Great question.
Yeah, it is a good question. I personally don't know the answer to it. Amazon, yeah. Get some drones to drop it up there. No. The Northwest Company, sure. What? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go.
You need service serving the Arctic in all parts of the world. And this head office is in Winnipeg.
Oh, Winnipeg, okay.
And Kennedy is the CEO.
That answered it.
My question is based on a long life of thinking about our country and an experience 11 days ago. I have a question about the future. I was flying from Winnipeg to Toronto, which I've done many times, but it was dark, it was an evening, and I normally don't sit by the window, but I sat by the window, and I was on the south side of the plane. I looked out. And basically, from the time we left Winnipeg to the time we arrived around the GTA, I saw no lights. I flew south of Thunder Bay. And so the thought has come to me, should we be moving our capital city north and west? Other countries have done that. Brazil would be an example, to somewhere north of Sault Ste. Marie so we can get a better, the government being closer to all of the citizens and all of the activities.
Anybody want to tackle that?
Well, I'll take the easy way out and say there's no real answer to that question. I mean, I'm sure Winnipeg would love to host it and have a whole bunch of national museums go there. But here, Chris.
I mean, are you saying Brasilia isn't a good example? My understanding, it's a disaster. It's like a modernist nightmare of a city, from what I understand, as an example. But I don't know. I agree with. I've recently heard a suggestion that where did I hear this? Every federal government department that doesn't have to do with what's in Ottawa should be moved out. That seems like a fascinating idea. They did in Ontario. The city I live in, Peterborough, has the Minister of Natural Resources, helps the local economy. Maybe we could take that.
All right, we've got three more questions.
I want to throw a question at you based on the writings of one of the great scholars to come from the city, Harold Innes. If you read Innes's work on staples, he is someone who argued that when Canada's colonies faced turbulence from the outside, their way of dealing with it or evolving was to obtain scale. First through combining the two Canadas and then ultimately through confederation. Is that an idea that maybe we ought to take to heart today? Is maybe that are an analog from Canadian history that we ought to be using to inform our future? We don't necessarily have to scale by combining with Orange Man Bad. European Union, the idea of Kanzuk, there are other ways to create some kind of higher population and potentially greater wealth to enable us to protect our country and to develop our country, particularly in the north. So does any of that make sense, or am I doing terrible violence to history?
I mean, Of course, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I don't know, when you look at the demographic situation of a lot of the Western European nations, they don't seem to me that there's going to be a lot of consumption going on there. They don't really have any young people. When you look at their demographic pyramids well, they're like inverted pyramids, so very top heavy. So I don't know what the market is like. You know, they want to be export nations, but we want to be an export nation too. There's a lot of countries that all want to be export nations, and not a lot that want to be import nations. So that's a problem all around the world.
I made him answer it first so I could think. I mean, what you're suggesting is, I mean, you're suggesting two things. One, grow, like, you know, expand in some way, population-wise, or joining with someone else. I mean, I'm just thinking about the Century Project, which some of you might know about, this project to grow Canada's population to 100 million by 2100, which seemed to have influenced the Trudeau government's policy on immigration, which I think by a kind of nonpartisan standard would be the biggest disaster in recent Canadian political history. So I think it would be dangerous to think about that has to be done properly if you want to grow Canada. I think everyone's in favor of growing Canada, but not doing it in an irresponsible way. But I wonder if growth I wonder if the problem of Canada is that it's not trying to do things better, right? You know, that the idea is that we're going to grow our economy by just getting more people in. It was a way of not thinking about Canada's actual problems. And you just solve it by, we get more people, the economy grows. But you're not actually thinking, why is Canada's economic growth been so low? Why is productivity so far down? I don't know. I would see it as maybe a dilemma there. I'm not saying that's what you're suggesting. I know you're suggesting something different.
All right.
And the idea that, you know, if in our country 40% of the people are not net contributors in terms of tax, depending on who you bring in as immigrants, if they're part of the 40%, then they're a net drag on the economy. They're not contributing anything to the overall national prosperity. So you have to pick and choose people that are going to, you know, have an outsized contribution to the economy. It can't be anyone. Otherwise, that's not solving any of our problems.
All right, thank you. Two more questions.
I'd like to turn our attention back to 1867. There's the British North America Act, but does anything else come to people's mind that happened in 1867 that bears on this question? The American purchase of Alaska. Between those two observations, what I want to ask you is, would you think that perhaps the building of the CPR was a defensive reaction and a desperate one at that?
Well, for sure. I mean, you know, Johnny MacDonald knew that all that land was going to naturally fall into the hands of the United States. That was their manifest destiny. Like we were talking about. I mean, British Columbia already was part of the United States in everything but name. Like we mentioned, their commerce, their travel, their communication, even their postal system was American at that time, and they had Alaska to the north. They were surrounded by the U.S. and multiple mountain ranges to get across before they could connect to anything even remotely associated with Canada. So, yeah, probably.
All right, we do have one more question before I ask Don to thank our guests, but I want to remind everybody that we have copies of Dominion and Company here at the back for both in paperback, $27 each. And Allison and Carmen will be happy to help you, and Stephen will be happy to assign them for you when once you've bought that. So our last question is right here.
Repeat the question. The mic wasn't on. Sorry, the mic wasn't on.
I'm sorry. Louis Riel Rebellion, the Eastern Canadians sent their army out to Western Canada to establish a country. Did they go out to establish a country or their country?
they wanted to push their country further into that territory. Like, for sure, they were claiming it. That's why I sometimes refer to Canada at that time as a bit of an empire, like it's empire adjacent. I mean, they were trying to, claim political jurisdiction over lands that were not naturally part of their, economy or their political history. They just took that land and they acquired it from the Hudson's Bay Company. To what extent the Hudson's Bay Company had any kind of ownership over that land, they're just being a commercial entity, is open to debate, I'm pretty sure. But really what they wanted was to, make sure that that land didn't go to the United States, first and foremost. They didn't want it. They didn't really have a firm grasp of what they would do with that land or how they would manage it or how they would control it. But for...
Okay, one more thing now. They built the railroad out to Western Canada. The railroad went out there primarily to take all of the cheap things from Western Canada and ship them back to the east, and to send all of the expensive things made in Eastern Canada back out to the west. And he's from Winnipeg. I am. And that has been going on. As a matter of fact, Winnipeg did own the oil industry for a long period of time, and Eastern Canada stole the oil industry from Western Canada. And that was for their own benefit on money. And that was, the railroad was built to make Eastern Canada money. That's my opinion.
Well, it did make money to Eastern Canada, of course, but it also created Western Canada. I mean, without a railway, I guess Winnipeg could have been connected down into the United States, down to St. Paul. There would have been a railway there, or in fact there was. But it wouldn't be part of Canada. But I think, just talk to the broader theme of what you were mentioning, and I think you would agree, that's one of the big issues in Canadian history all the way along, is the people have been raging against those freight rates. It doesn't sound like such an exciting thing, but generations of people basically have been arguing over that. Do you have anything to add? No? Too dangerous.
Those grudges die hard. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm Don Cranston. I'm the chair of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education. Thank you to both our guests this evening for a great evening. I just want to give a quick recap of the activities of the CIHE. For the last 3 years, we have been primarily reactionary to defend Canadian history, and particularly the reputations of Canadians who had been attacked based on some very bad history and bad facts, bad interpretations. And Edgerton Ryerson, Sir John A. Macdonald, Henry Dundas. And those fights have been very successful. There have been some great changes recently. Yes. We, as Lynn MacDonald stated, that it's not over. The TMU subway station is now existing, and I hear people referring to it as Timu, and they didn't know they named a subway station after Timu Solani, the hockey player. It's just incredible. So these battles continue, but there has been some good news in all this. The prevention of the renaming of Dundas Street, the stopping the renaming of the 3 schools in the Toronto District School Board, the unboxing of Sir John A. Macdonald statue at Queen's Park, the statues on the way back up the Prime Minister's path in Wilmot Township, and good activity in other areas across Canada, Montreal, Kingston, Charlottetown, Picton. So that battle continues. We are pivoting, however, as an organization. So we've been reactionary in the past. Now we're being proactive. And as the mission statement says, promoting historical literacy through education, through research, education, and engagement in the public square. That goes forward. And as a child, I used to get very upset when people said that Canadian history was boring. As we heard tonight, it is definitely not. And some of those issues from the past still reverberate today, Mr. Nelson. So anyways, we appreciate you being here tonight. All this activity does require money. If you are so inclined, please go on to our website where you can see a donate button to assist us in continuing to fight the fight. Thank you all, and a safe journey home this evening.